Hey everyone, welcome back to another Q&A video. In this week's event, we discussed three things, which were how to form frameworks to questions, which is something I discuss a lot on this channel, how you can approach some section 1 questions and how it's not that different to section 3, and finally we did a question on section 3 physics. So if any of those things sound interesting to you, please watch on till the end of the video. If you're new here, I run a Heartbeat community, which is really just a place where people can share resources, chat with each other, and I run some free events like this weekly Q&A, just answering any of your questions. So if you think that sounds interesting and want to get involved, I'll leave a link in the description and it's completely free to join. And please like, comment, and subscribe. So first question that I got, and I kind of grouped these all together. So there's one by Patrick and two by Alan, which were all kind of similar in theme, I thought. So I thought I'd just kind of group these together. Patrick was kind of asking about, I don't know if you guys can read this because it'd be probably quite small, but Patrick was kind of asking about frameworks. He sees some kind of examples in there, but he doesn't quite understand what the frameworks mean, the skills required, etc. Just elaborate on that a little bit more. Alan was kind of asking a little bit of a similar question in a way, is that kind of how do you use the questions to then find out what to study, and then also just generally what's a good split of study time and some other stuff. So I'll get onto the other stuff a little bit later. But what I wanted to do just to answer that question about the frameworks was to go through the sheet that Patrick was talking about. So this is my Excel sheet for a GAMSAT analysis. Oh, we've got Alan with his camera on. Thank you, Alan. So great to see. So yeah, so this is kind of how I grouped it. And I've talked about this a little bit, but I think it is a really important aspect of your study. So I thought I'd just go over it again. So these ones are just what I put in there at the time, but I'd really urge you to steer away from that. And as Patrick was kind of saying, this is the column that I would consider to be the framework column. And why I say this is the more important one to include is just that these don't really tell you anything about the question. You could have figure interpretation or graph interpretation or whatever. Maybe we've even got an example. So we've got interpreting text. Oh, that's a bad example. But I promise you, there are times when you could have a graph interpretation in physics or biology or chemistry or whatever. So it's really important that you actually look at those questions together rather than separate them based on their topic. It's far more useful to look at what you're actually doing in those questions and trying to generalize that into something that you could use going forward. And I think your mic might be off. Sorry, on. Just, I don't know, might be annoying someone. Not me, but so the what was I saying? So yes, so this is kind of the column that I would put a lot of effort into. And in retrospect, I could have done this a whole lot better. But, you know, I learned that as I went, you know, this is what's important. So if we, and then from that, just to kind of go into Alan's questions about how you use that to find things to study. So from, you can see in this column here, or these two columns here, these are things that I could study. This is probably a bad example because I got quite a few right at the start on this one. But if you see things like this, you know, electronegativity is something that I need to study. What's that? I had to recognize. So that's something genetics. I need to keep practicing dihybrid crosses. So as you kind of go through and you look at more and more of these questions and what you got wrong, you start, it naturally comes out that you find things that you need to study for. But the difference is when you're looking at it in kind of a framework point of view, rather than a topic point of view, you are actually finding things that are relevant to that question, if that makes sense. So, Alan, you're actually here. Did that help at all? What do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. Pardon the South African accent. I think
I like it.
You might be one of a very small group. I think, to be honest, I hadn't had which is my own fault, enough of a read of these spreadsheets, because that helped a lot. I still do think that as someone with mostly a non-science background, it still seems very overwhelming. Whereas something like a textbook or whatever, as I think I said in one of my questions, is a bit less daunting because there's like a finite set of chapters. But this, yeah, it definitely helped. So yeah, thanks very much.
And that's the thing. I think a lot of people do get sucked into that trap because it does feel less daunting and it's more familiar. But I think when you do it this way and you actually use the questions, you start. It's really difficult. I'm not saying that the questions are easy, but they're not easy for me from a science background. So when I started, I'd done 1.5 science degrees. I still found the questions really difficult. So that should kind of tell you that it's not really about the scientific literacy, because I think that the level of science understanding that you need is actually quite low. And that should be a little bit consoling to you, is that if you can find those simple concepts, you kind of know that you've got all the information, but the questions are still hard. So if it's not missing content, what is it? And I think this is the best way to go through and actually find out what those things are, because a lot of it is actually how you approach the questions. So again, that was just my tab during my study. And as I've said, I would put more effort into that as I'd go on. So this is my little template one. And I just went through and, I showed this last week, but I just, put in some mock data in here. But that's the kind of detail, I think, if you want to do it properly, that's what I would really be including in here. So, difficult to interpret meaning from the words provided. So then you can start to build things. I wrote here, probably a good idea to associate oxygen with metabolic rate or something like that. So you start to kind of look at these things a little bit differently and think about how you can actually associate words. And then in this one with units, I calculated the units wrong. So what am I going to go practice? Maybe some index laws, some unit conversion, etc. So this is kind of, again, I think that's how you should group the questions by the kind of problem-solving approach that's required. That will help identify the simple concepts that you need, as well as the skills that you need. And then through that process, it'll also hopefully help you identify those gaps which you need to study a little bit more for. Timothy, you had a question? Fire away.
Yeah, so I don't really know what point or in your plan you would do this, but at some point after getting a question wrong, let's say, or maybe you guessed it and you got it right somehow, presumably you go back, look at how it's done, or like try to figure out how it's done. Mm-hmm. In doing that, do you actually map out your steps of figuring it out, or do you just keep it in mind as a mental note?
That's a really good point. So that's exactly how I would do it. So I'd get it wrong, or if I got it right and I wasn't confident, so you would have seen that on, if I go back to this sheet, if I was right, I think I saw one on this one here. So, this is section 1, but same kind of thing. So did I get it right? Yes. Was I confident? No. So that's one that I'd actually mark down as one that I got incorrect. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Once I have got it wrong, like, we'll take this one here, for example. So I've got it wrong, and then I figured out what I did wrong. And in this case, it's that there was a mismatch between the units that they gave me and the units in the equation, and I didn't notice that. So I've said that I need to remember to check units. Maybe I've got some kind of, who knows, it's hard to build those things, but that's kind of just a habit thing that maybe every time I look at something with a unit, that I actually do check the units. And things like, I was thinking about this one, got it right and I was confident. Why did I write this? Needed V equals IR to calculate ratio. What I'm assuming is that I actually struggled with this in the past, and I've kind of said this to myself as a bit of an encouragement for, you've actually figured that framework out. So yeah, that was kind of a bit of a deviation from your question, but yes, I would figure out the process to get there and then figure out where I deviated and maybe some ways that I could in future not deviate and actually get to the right answer. And you do start to see once you've actually mapped out as much as you can, like you don't want to get too crazy about it, but if you can map out like a 3 to 5 step process for a question, that's a really good basis. And then if you have some idea of what that process is, and then you see a similar question and it goes through, maybe the first 3 steps are the same or something, and you can actually kind of group them together a little bit. So yeah, that's kind of how I would think about grouping them into frameworks, is by those shared skills. Anyone else have any questions on that? I think that was really good. And look, I put a big emphasis on it. I wish, like you probably saw last week, I did that little rough study timetable. I'd spend at least a third of my time studying my mistakes and coming up with ways that that I can not make them in the future. Because this one was my last one that I did. So you can see that like I've done really well on this, and I think that's a demonstration of improvement through this process, because you see this one, this is just one test before, really not that good. And there are also things in here like a lot of time management, which I've talked about before. So all of those things you just kind of fish out, you put it there, and you just try to get better every single time. And that's kind of, yeah, in short, how I'd summarize it. Okay, cool. Well, I think that was good. I think that one covered that. So, and last little thing just to cap it off, it doesn't mean that you don't study theory. You know, sometimes, like I just showed you that example of needed V equals IR to work out the question, and we'll go through a question later which needs an equation. So sometimes you do just need to have that knowledge, but I would try to think about it in terms of, am I going to study the content first, or am I going to study the question first, and then from the question figure out what I need to know and then study it that way, rather than going in reverse when you study all this content and you don't really know which parts are applicable. If you've studied 10 things, it's hard to know how to apply them, and it's kind of easier to retrofit it, if that makes sense. Okay, the next couple of questions, we're going well for time. So the next couple of questions were about some worked solutions. So I've decided to step out of my comfort zone, and we're going to a section 1 question, believe it or not. And I thought this was actually quite a good one to go through, because I want to show that I really think about section 1 and section 3 in a very, very similar way. And if you document things in a similar way to what I'm saying for section 3, I think it'll work really well for section 1 as well. I put way more emphasis on section 3, but if I didn't get into medicine, I would have 100% done the same thing for section 1, and I think it would have worked really well. The only difference would be I'd be categorizing them, you know, obviously not by graph interpretation or unit conversion or anything like that, but some other framework. And I don't particularly know what those are, because I haven't quite gone through that process, but I do believe that you could get the same results with that technique. And I kind of want to just show, I think that, yeah, a lot of people really struggle with how they even approach questions. And I think that's something that you can take the same approach to section 3 as section 1. And it's all about, you know, I speak a lot about where am I looking, what am I looking for, what am I trying to understand? You know, they're things that I talk about a lot in the section 3. But I wanted to show this question because I think it actually applies quite well. And it's also, you know, it's a freely available piece of text. So so I can show it and not worry about ASA cracking down on me. So this one's from practice test 1, 56 to 60. And I've just basically highlighted the parts of text that the questions are about. So 56, the first question, is relating to this yellow line here. And it says, the words, "I do not complain of the greater thickness of the atmosphere," suggest despair, self-pity, optimism, or resignation. So when I think about if you think about section 3, what do? I always go to the question and I think, what do I need to understand? So in this case, it kind of helps you a little bit with section 1 because it tells you where to go. So it's almost a little bit more, once you have the statement that you need to understand, that's the thing where you're then looking for more information. So if I'm reading that yellow sentence, the things that my eyes are drawn to are maybe complain. And then I feel like I need to understand what this greater thickness of the atmosphere means. That's something I don't really understand. So if you think back, relating to section 3, there's always terms that I don't really know, and I go back and I try to understand them. So here, I'm going to try to understand what these terms mean. So I'm looking for anything about atmosphere, and if we kind of look back here, maybe this previous sentence, I don't really know where to stop it. Well, just the first sentence, okay? First sentence is kind of talking about life like a passage, and it grows narrower and darker. And then it says something, stifled for want of breath at last. So I've associated want of breath with greater thickness of the atmosphere. That kind of ties in quite well. And then exploring a passage of narrow darkness, he's probably talking about something like death, right? And if you look a little bit later on, you do get more of more clues that it's about death and stuff like that. Okay, so you can kind of, similar to what I do with section 3, I can kind of reframe that yellow sentence to be something about not complaining about death as I approach the narrow house. So he's not complaining about death as he's getting closer to death. So if we think again about those options, there's despair. Well, he's not really despairing because he's not complaining. Self-pity, again, not really, he's not complaining. If I was looking for self-pity, if I've got a cold or something, I'm complaining all the time when I got the man flu. Optimism, it's probably not optimistic. He's not complaining, but he's not happy. He's just kind of accepting it. And that brings us to the last option, which is D, which is resignation. And I think that shows that it fits very well, that it's still a similar process. It's about finding the information and then finding relevant pieces of information from there. What does everyone think? Any thoughts on that, or should I just keep pressing on? Maybe just yell it out because I'm on another tab, wherever that was.
Hi, Jude. Sorry. Not to be annoying, but just about that particular question that you just went through. Something that would worry me is, I perfectly agree with your deduction that it would be resignation. But if I would look at just those two sentences, I would think, maybe he's saying he doesn't complain, or she doesn't complain, but then, she would go on to, or the writer would go on to say that actually they are optimistic or something. And to be honest, maybe I'm just a schmuck, but I only was super confident about saying resignation, to be honest, when I read the whole passage.
That's interesting.
Especially like a big hint was the blue thing that you highlighted, ready if not willing.
Because that's in relation to another question later on. So
whoops. Sorry, but I don't know. I guess when it comes to written passages in which an idea can be built on, or perhaps further clarified, do you think?
Well, that's interesting. So let me take you to the next one, because I do kind of agree with you, but I approach it very much in terms of, if anyone's seen my section 3 approach, it's always like I find one thing and then I use that to piggyback onto the next thing. And I kind of have a threshold of when I'm pretty confident. And I'm kind of thinking about genetics or something like that. So genetics is quite a well-defined thing where you find your genotypes and then you do your Punnett square and you find out your ratios. And I always have a step in genetics where I then check my assumptions. So I think that is something that you could maybe do here. I personally wouldn't read the whole passage because I do feel like the tone can change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it changes the opinion of the previous sentence. Now, again, I'm also no expert in section 1, but I looked at this question and I did get one of them wrong, I'll be honest, but the fact that I got a few of them right just by kind of a similar approach is kind of what I wanted to demonstrate. So that's it. Look, there could be, these are things that if you were making a section 1 framework, maybe you put it in like that. Like maybe there is some question type where there are modifiers later in the text and that actually completely changes the meaning of that sentence, you know? So I don't completely know what the right answer is here, but I guess what I wanted to demonstrate is just that you can apply a very similar approach. And what I really encourage people to do is get to the kind of meat of it quickly and try to jump around and not necessarily understand everything that they're reading, particularly for the science section, but I still think it works for section 1. So look, who knows? It's just, I do kind of agree with you, but this one, so the second question, that was actually one I wanted to point out because you were saying that you changed your mind later on in this. So this second question is saying, I felt it more formally refers to a part of the writer's life that was characterized by enforced inactivity, energy and ambition, and we'll come back to these options, so don't try to remember them, achievement and acclaim, idleness and contempt. So when I read that sentence, you see how with the yellow part I kind of went up here because I was trying to define what thickness of atmosphere meant. With I felt it more formally, what I really need to understand is what formally means. And I kind of think, well, you know, former, that's something in the past. So I'm reading for something about his past. So when I'm looking through, I'm just skimming. And I do this all the time. This is like my 3 words rule with those like keyword searches. And I'm looking through and I find this here. Maybe not the whole thing. Probably there is where I'd draw the line. So in my youth, I could not behold him for the crowd of objects and feelings, and hope stood always between us, saying, never mind that, old fellow. So that's, you know, that is something like what you're saying then, Alan, is that formally, and I'm actually reading some evidence down here. And I think a mistake that a lot of people make is they read kind of that sentence that it's involved in and don't look more widely. So maybe this is kind of what you were talking about. I don't know. But that is something where I would go later in the piece to see if there was any evidence to support that. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I reacted in the chat.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've got a few little things going, and don't have multiple monitors, unfortunately. So yeah, that's kind of how, you know, I'm still doing the same thing. I'm finding keywords, I'm looking for evidence, and then I'm going from there. And then from that, you know, you can kind of, if I can't remember what I said here. In my youth, I could not behold him for the crowd of objects and feelings and hope. So I kind of feel like, so there was enforced inactivity. That's not right, because he kind of sounds quite active and like denying death in a way, especially when you consider the previous sentence in yellow, which is saying, you know, I don't complain. So now he's accepting it. That sounds like he wasn't accepting it then. Energy and ambition, which I like because he sounds quite energetic, and objects and feelings, you know, that's probably a key word there. Achievement and acclaim. I don't see anything about achievement, so I just look through the rest. If I had lived indeed, I should not. So yeah, maybe this sentence is relevant, the next one actually. So if I had lived indeed, so it sounds like he hasn't felt like he lived. So probably not achievement and acclaim. Idleness and contentment. I mean, maybe it doesn't sound like he was idle. It sounds like he wanted to live, but just didn't really live. So, that's kind of a way that you could, you can find statements later down that actually support something. So, very similar approach to section 3. I'll skim through the rest of them because I don't want to spend too much time on the evil section 1. But in the context of the passage as a whole, the statement so that also tells you stuff. So in the context of the passage as a whole, so that's kind of saying you need to assess it, within a wider context. The statement, I am too much in a world of abstraction, which is in purple here, implies apathy, isolation, acceptance, ambivalence. So when I looked at this one, I kind of saw that semicolon, and I thought anything after the semicolon is really, that's defining abstraction. So if you wanted to put these into a framework, as soon as I saw that semicolon, I was thinking that whatever comes next is a definition. So I was kind of looking at that really intently. So you can kind of find, maybe this is a definition question. Maybe this was like a, I don't know. Yeah, I wish I kind of had more frameworks for section 1, but I guess what I wanted to get across is that, you can apply the same process is what I'm trying to say. Emptiness and desolation. So, I felt there's a lot of isolation there. So that's why I picked B. Going down to 59, I struggled with this one. I think this is one I got wrong, actually, but it's about this statement here. On these conditions, I'm willing to depart. So contains an element of wry humour, contains an element of self-delusion, cynicism and indifference, affirms the value of the writer's life and work. So again, this is kind of similar to the green one, on these conditions. So what are these conditions? So I would go back, and if you kind of look and you see all these things about I would, I should like, those kind of statements are really implying that these are the conditions that he would like to be ready to die. So it's not really affirming the value of the writer's life and work, because it seems like he has, I know there's a lot of underlining and bolding and stuff here, but I hope you can, it's more about the process than the actual answers themselves. But, I didn't feel like that was really affirming the value, because it was saying he hasn't really achieved those things. Self-delusion, I don't think that's right, because based on what he said, previously, like up here, a life unfulfilled, a marriage with joy unconsummated, it doesn't sound like he really had a great life. So I don't think that's self-delusion. Cynicism and indifference, it doesn't sound like he's indifferent. I don't know about cynicism, but he doesn't sound indifferent to it. He sounds kind of unhappy about it. And then I didn't quite understand wry humour. So I can't remember which one I picked. I think I actually might have picked self-delusion, actually. But I looked up wry, and that means sarcastic. And when you this maybe is like a vocab question. Maybe that could be an element of your section 1 framework, is that if you knew what wry meant, because if that was sarcastic, that would be very, very easy to answer, actually. So if you can kind of, maybe expand your vocab a little bit, that could help you as well. And then in the last question is just in the last sentence of the passage, which is the one I haven't read, the writer accepts his situation, accepts responsibility for his mistakes, protests or blames himself. But I've thought and suffered too much to be willing to have thought and suffered in vain. So it doesn't sound like he's really blaming himself there, or like taking responsibility for his mistakes, because it doesn't sound like he's really made. Well, I guess he's kind of maybe you could argue it that way, but I felt like that was a very protesting statement, because it sounds like, especially with the one in blue, It doesn't sound like he's willing to depart, to put it in a kind of more poetic way. So yeah, I hope that was kind of helpful. I thought it would be interesting to go through a section 1 question, because I really do believe that the process to approaching them is very, very similar. And that really is about understanding what the question's about, understanding what information you have, and understanding how you can use that information to kind of draw conclusions about, the question that they're asking. So I thought this was a decent question to demonstrate that. And I guess, also just to show that you can build frameworks around section 1 as well. I just probably am not the person to tell you what those are, because I didn't quite get up to that. So, but yeah, I hope that was helpful. Did anyone have any questions about that? Sounds good. Okay. And we also had one more question in the heartbeat, another worked solution one, which was from Thumith, and that was sample questions 7 to 9. So I'll just get my iPad up for this one. So back to section 3, the safe space of section 3. So we kind of had this slide slot, and it had a ball on it. And the first question was loosely, everyone's probably seen this one, I feel like. And it kind of said, what happens to the total mechanical energy as the ball moves from here to where I've drawn here? And I think this is where, there are definitely some, little concepts that I think are really, really important. And I think one in physics is that energy can't be created or destroyed unless, something is added to that system. So this will always be constant. And what actually happens is that you have these two equations: potential energy equals mass times gravity times height, and kinetic energy equals half mv squared, mass times velocity squared. And really these two things are just in balance. So as one thing at the top, because this has height in it, when you're at the top, the height is highest, and then as it goes down, that's all converted to velocity, but the energy actually remains constant. So this is something that applies beyond just potential energy and kinetic energy, is that you can't really destroy any energy. So most things, unless that energy is leaving or more energy is being added in, you're not actually going to change the energy of the system. So everything remains constant. So whenever I see a question asking about a change in energy or something like that, unless something's happened, unless something's acted on it, it's always the same. So that's the first question. Anyone just yell out as well if you had any queries that you wanted me to clarify. That's the purpose of these. No? Cool. And then the second one was actually calculating the change in potential energy as we go from here to here. Now it tells us, I'm just going to get these figures right. So it tells us that this is 10 centimeters. This is 2 centimeters, the ball. And then this bit here is 6 centimeters. So by that, we can kind of say, well, these two added together are 8. So this part will also be 2 centimeters. So obviously, if we're going from, if we're going from here in blue down to red, we need to know if the formula is mass times gravity times height, we need to know the height that it ends up at. And this is a bit of a common trap that I noticed. So what do you think? So it obviously starts at 10 centimeters. Does anyone want to have a think, just first thing that pops into their head, about the height that it ends up at? And even though I've done a really bad drawing, this height here down the bottom is the same as that height there. So this is 2 centimeters. No one want to hazard a guess?
Wait, a guess as to what, sorry?
To the height. So we need to use this potential energy equation. So
would you not end up at like 3 centimeters above the surface level?
3, yeah. So 3. So that's a little. I think that's actually a bit of a trap. Is that you need to calculate all of these equations, or at least potential energy, from the center of mass. So that's actually 3 centimeters. So I think a lot of people put in 2 centimeters because they just say it's gone from 10 and now it's at 2 down here. But you also need to just keep in mind that the ball also has a bit of a height to it, and it's from the center of mass. So yeah, so 3 is good. And when I'm doing these questions, a lot of the time you can actually simplify the maths a little bit. It's a little bit dodgy. I know I talk about doing good maths processes, but you can, if the mass and the gravity are going to be constant, which they are, because gravity is always 10 and the mass is going to be the same of the ball, really it just comes down to the change in height is going to be the difference between the two. So if we go down, but no, maybe I will do it actually. I'll put in 50 for the mass. I know it should be in kilos, but this is kind of what I was talking about, because as long as I'm consistent, it won't matter and it'll just make my life a little bit easier. Times 10 times, it'll be the change in height, which is 7 centimeters. So I know all these units are a bit AWOL, but basically all I really want to see is the 5 times the 7, which will be 35. So the answer will be C, because that's the only one with 3.5 in it. That was really lazy. I should just do it properly. So 50 grams in kilograms will be 0.05 kilograms, so 5 times 10 to the negative 2. We've got gravity, which is 10, and we've got, we need meters, so we've got 7, the decrease in height is 7 centimeters, which is 0.07 meters, so it's times 7 times 10 to the negative 2. Maybe it doesn't need to be that, because I think that's going to give me the wrong answer. Anyway, so I get 35 here times 10 to the negative 2 times 10 times 10 to the negative 2. So it'll be 35 times 10 to the, so negative 4 plus 1, negative 3. Well, that will be right. 3.5 by 10 to the negative 2 joules. That's me not doing it lazy. So that's question 8, how you'd solve that one. So just a bit of index laws and using that equation. And then the last one is basically the same as the first one, except it's saying if you dropped the ball, but this thing could slide around. So basically how I'm imagining it is you've got a 3D thing like that. That is a horrible drawing. Oh my gosh. So you drop the ball down and it goes up here and then it comes back this way. But it says that the actual thing that it's in, this kind of, skate bowl kind of thing in blue, it can actually move freely across the table that it's on. So I would be thinking as the ball comes down here, it's actually going to be applying a force against this. And then it's going to be going up here. It's going to be applying a force this way. And because that thing is free to move, it's actually going to lose energy. So that's kind of a situation different to what I was talking about at the start, where you're not losing energy or you're not gaining energy. In this case, you're actually losing it because it goes into moving the actual machine that it's sitting in. So does that make sense? Matthew, they want to ask the question. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It was mainly that last question, number 9, that stumped me quite a bit there.
Yeah, so I think
restaurant,
you just keep it simple as well, because that question has a lot of text. Like, it's got a lot of things that you can focus on. And I think the more and more you just have a simple concept in mind, the easier it is to actually work through that concept, because then you just say, well, energy can't be created or destroyed. So am I losing any energy? And I'll just kind of think, well, if I'm, if something's rolling around in here, it's going to be like pushing it this way and this way and this way and this way. That's going to be losing energy every time, and it's coming from the ball. So for this one, it would decrease only, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like it was very confusing because they gave you the mass of the slide slot for some reason or whatever reason, and I was
Probably
very
to distract you, honestly.
Yeah.
Like they put things in there to try to think that can you actually pick these apart and figure out what's important. And I think more and more you'll see that, yeah, they have a lot of red herrings in the questions.
right. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, does anyone else have any questions?
Wait, sorry. Just one thing. Oh, actually, no, never mind. I was looking at the wrong section. That's fine. You're right. Yeah.
Oh, were you going to
Yeah, I
out-
went to section 1, question 9, and it was a different answer. I was like, oh, no, you're right.
Don't look, if that ever happens and I show you a solution and then it's actually wrong, just don't say anything, all right? Just keep it a secret. All right, does anyone have any questions about this one or any others? Because that's kind of everything that I had from the community chat. So that's actually worked out quite well. We've still got kind of 15 minutes for any questions that you guys might have. Alan.
Sorry, last time I promised. Just
No, I love it. Keep going.
Two quick ones. I was just wondering about your thoughts on the question I asked a while ago. Sorry, I asked so many. It's hard to keep track.
No, I like the questions. It's good to have.
Like I sort of, I totally grant your point about looking at what to study from the questions, but roughly, if you had to say of like gun to your head, if you had to choose ratios of study time for S3 between bio and then the much scarier chemistry and the much scarier physics, what would that sort of ratio be? And then the last question is, given the IRT and such, do you think in general one ought not to answer questions that one is not confident in because of things like negative marking, which they had at my university, which sucks, which penalizes you for trying? Or do you think, just give it a bash?
Yeah. I hope that wasn't a threat as well, the gun to the head.
No, it's right. Just
I'm kidding. I say that all the time. And I'm kind of like, that is a little bit confronting sometimes to some people. Not, I like the saying though. So I might just answer the second one first. So that was about with item response theory, if you should answer questions that you're not so confident in or just leave them. Briefly, item response theory is just a way that ACER marks the exam so that they can essentially they can determine if you're guessing or not. So if person 1 got the first 2 wrong and then they got the last 3 right, versus person 2 who got the first 3 right versus the last 2 wrong, you would kind of say that this person knew these 3 and then these ones were just too hard. But because GAMSAT questions usually use information from previous questions and they generally get harder as they go through the STEM, it's very unlikely that you could, it's not likely that you would know the last 3 without knowing the first 2. So they would say that this person has guessed a little bit and therefore they won't get 3 out of 5. They might get something lower. I don't know how much lower, but they would get something lower. So to answer your question, I think with the item response theory in mind, I wouldn't answer any question that I don't know how to solve. So I had a thing where I would just look at it and within 30 seconds, if I knew how to solve it, I would spend however much time it took to solve it. So if it was 5 questions and it took me 15 minutes or something like that, I wouldn't be that upset. I would think that's a good investment of my time if I'm confident that I'm going to get them right because I've figured out what the problem is. So, and you're going to make up that time anyway because you're going to skip some stems that you don't know. So it's very, very valuable to spend your time where you're going to be likely to get more of the STEM right. So yeah, I would skip things that I don't know how to do. And then if I had a gun to my head and I had to allocate study time, so your first question, I think that the bio concepts are really easy to understand. I think that really it's basically, you know, how do all the organ systems of the body work briefly, you know, like you breathe air in, the heart beats blood around the body, the GIT absorbs nutrients from food, stuff like that. Nothing too crazy. Osmosis, you know, genetics, that kind of stuff. There's not really that much there in bio. They're really tricky questions and they have little traps there. So I think you don't need to do much for bio. Chemistry would be the one where I would spend the most time because they actually do have skills that you need. So for organic reactions, even if you not a sad react there. So if you kind of believe me and you say, oh yeah, there's an organic reactions framework, there's a stereochemistry framework, there's a blah, blah, blah framework or whatever, you know, isomers, all of those need you to be able to name molecules. They need you to be able to rotate molecules. They need you to be able to, kind of determine what's an isomer and like generally just know how to, just how to work with organic reactions. So that would be I'd say that would be the most background knowledge for chemistry. Physics, I really think that you can get away with just some maths. So if I had to divvy it up, like I think if you have maths understanding about how variables relate to each other, how you can substitute formulas into other formulas, those kinds of skills, I think you can get a really long way with physics, and there aren't that many questions. So I remember I had one on my exam, seemed to be something conceptual, and I just didn't understand it, and I was like, I'll happily get that one wrong if I get all the rest of them right. So I would say 75% chemistry and maybe 15 physics and 10% bio. Honestly, I think chem is the most important because all of the other ones you can figure them out somewhat. Well, a lot of them you can figure out with just some other techniques that you're going to need anyway, like maths and graph analysis and looking at pathways and, you know, identifying problem statements and stuff like that. So they don't really require anything different, but chemistry, I think, has a few things that you do need to understand. But I wouldn't be going into the depths of like a chemistry course in saying that. I would still be just like, I'd still be looking at the questions. And a good way I like to think about it is if you look at the question and there's something you don't understand, what would you Google? So if you don't know what to Google, then I think you don't know what you're doing. So if you can look at the question and you can Google something, then that's something you need to learn and see if that helps you out. But I think that's always a good little sanity check is what are you Googling? Seamus, I think, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, but I put it down because I didn't want to interrupt. But essentially, what I was wondering is how integral is knowing all the formulas for physics, because like the other two subjects, bio doesn't really have formulas. Chemistry, I know all of like all the necessary ones, but when it comes to physics, I just feel like there's a lot, and they are very interchangeable with one another in the sense that you can pretty much link them up very nicely, but then that makes it very convoluted in terms of answering questions.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are definitely, I'm just bringing up a document that I made. So if no one has this, let me know, and I can send this to you. But this is a little document I made of essential formulas, and it's mainly physics. So yeah, I do have a couple in chemistry, but there's really nothing. I've just got moles and concentration. Maybe, you know, in retrospect, I could chuck in some solubility or something like that. But really, there's not much for chemistry. essential skills, I've got some stuff in there. And this is kind of what I was talking about with chemistry. Like, you need to be able to name and draw all these molecules. You need to be able to rotate molecules. These things all take quite a bit of time. Excuse me. And then, biology, as I said, there's really not that much. Like, just knowing how the organs work and some basic kind of things about, osmosis, maybe, that would help too. But yeah, these are the formulas that I've got. So how many is that? That's 4, 6, 8, 10, 13. So that's a decent whack of them. And as you said, I think it is important to know them because that you can interchange these things. So there was a question. I remember a question I think I've shown it. It's like that magnetism one, and it had the ion moving through the space, and you had to relate these two formulas for force. And then there was a later question, and it looked the same, but the variables in there were something about mass and radius, which is actually this equation here for centripetal force. So knowing those formulas, I think, is the main thing, because it's very common that they'll give you a formula and you use it and it's all good, and then it gives you something else and they've given you different variables and you think, how the hell am I going to get that? But then if you look past it, if you have like a list of formulas which you can use for force, you can actually use any of them to equal that. So I think it's very useful to know these formulas. I know it is quite a few, but yeah, I'd probably put it up there in importance. I think you can actually learn them quite quickly as well.